So it's so great that we were able to find some time to talk together here. I well, you contacted me, and I was happy to talk with you about some of the concerns that I think we both share over the possibilities of dialogue on YouTube. And the question of, I mean, some of the questions that I had that maybe, and I would like to maybe throw some out, and then maybe you could throw some at me, and maybe we could talk back and forth just about this. And I think some of the questions that I have that I think other people have are, to what extent are atheists or contemporary new atheists, not as a category, but is there a rise of a kind of dogmatic atheism? To what extent are many people rightly criticizing religious dogma? And, is it a rightful response to what they're seeing as something that's, sort of in their face? I think, part of the question is what room is there for religious traditions and cultural practices to retain an integrity and to withstand, forms of criticism, because I think they should be protected under various forms of free speech and protection for people to practice their own culture and to have those, in some way, to have those rights. I think, but also what are people to do with scientific discoveries that fundamentally challenge religious beliefs about those same phenomena or give counter explanations? I think some of those all put together are, why this debate is going on. And from my own perspective, I think part of the question becomes, who are we? That is, who are we, that animal who has grown in a capacity to have a global discussion about who it is and why it's facing global conflicts with each other in terms of its historicity. And we're not just animals at war with one another, because it's not just aggression. It seems to be whole belief systems that are in conflict, not simply animals reacting in a kind of immediate now over some scarce resources. Again, it's very abstract. So I guess at any rate, what do you take to be some of the obstacles to dialogue here that you've experienced on YouTube? Or in regard to some of those other questions, where would you want to come into some of this dialogue?
Well, I think we really need to touch, there's a lot of points there. So I think we really need to touch up on kind of one at a time and kind of put things into perspective first, I guess, in relation to this, what we call the new atheist movement, and what it's exactly reacting to and how it's acting. I do think that there is a form of sort of dogmatic atheism, and I hesitate to actually call it that because the term atheism has been used mainly in a negative sense, kind of as a non-position or a non-belief. So sort of dogmatic and atheist don't really go together from many atheist perspective. I prefer to call it a sort of a reemergence of anti-theism. I think that's a more appropriate way, a more positive way of putting it, because it also puts in perspective the position that's actually there. And while many atheists these days may call themselves by what they are not, or define themselves by the position they don't have, and I think there are reasons for that we can get into a little later, what's really being what seems to be has come, sort of manifesting itself now is this very popularized sort of anti-theism, and I think it's mainly a reaction to also resurgence of fundamentalist or very dogmatic, literalist interpretations of religious texts, especially in the West by many Christian, Protestant groups in particular. So what I see is it's basically just a more extreme reaction to an extreme reemergence of religious thought.
Right. No, I think that, I guess I'm sort of in agreement with you there. I wonder, though, if that some of that isn't properly motivated then. When you have people who are fundamentalist creationist, for example, they're giving a kind of dogma, and they have a lot of political power, they have money, they have resources, and some of this really needs to be challenged. And so, part of me is sympathetic. I do think it is a kind of anti-theism. But then, see, here's where it gets interesting to me, is that I think Christianity poses a unique position with regard to a lot of religions. That is, many other religions, take Judaism and Islam, and again, I can't speak with authority about either of those. I don't know either of those as well. But I think, to the best of my knowledge, these are largely religions of a people, and they're a cultural tradition, and you encumber a whole relation to history and cultural practices when you take on that set of beliefs and that faith. Whereas Christianity, at least among the contemporary proselytizing sort, which is among more and more people, it's a belief that all you have to do is accept Jesus and you'll have something like life after death or ultimate justice or ultimate recompense for all of life's hardships and inequalities. That, to me, is really a problem because it does create this kind of in-your-face proselytizing belief systems. People are very deluded. They're in, from my own perspective, they're in a kind of death denial, and they're misunderstanding what it means to be a place and moment of all that's ever been. I mean, we are places and moments that of all that has ever been. We're a kind of, I guess, lack of a better word. I mean, we're a kind of cosmic place, right, within the world itself, becoming aware of itself. And there does seem to be, in Christianity, both the problem there is that, again, it gets in other people's face, which creates a kind of anti-theistic reaction to it. But then in that response, I don't know what we're to say of those people who want to retain their cultural traditions and their cultural beliefs and all their practices, because I think we can't disentangle those from people's theism. See, I mean, I think when we say, well, you don't have any evidence for your belief in God, but a Greek Orthodox says, yeah, but I want to still skewer Slovakia, and I still want to have the festival, and I still participate in the Greek church. The Greek culture is part of what goes into being Greek Orthodox. Mm-hmm. Just as an example.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I agree with you regarding Christianity in particular. I think Christian dogma, especially in the Western interpretation, and because there is a difference between East and Western Christianity, I think there's a very significant difference, especially in dogma, is very abstract. It kind of separates you from the reality that's there. And I think there is more of an emotional attachment to Christianity, especially how it's practiced, like in the United States, than there is sort of an intellectual one. And I think this is a major problem, sort of growing anti-intellectualism among Christian denominations, which may also be kind of, also contributing to this sort of behavior. And I do see it as a problem that does need to be fought against. So I agree with you there. I think
But if I say to you, but take one of the problematic beliefs that seems to be, again, if someone wants to problematize a belief, it's the notion that this life here is a kind of dress rehearsal and that the afterlife is where justice will be served and where ultimately, I guess, the person will find recompense or justice, again, something like this. I don't know. I mean, aren't people who are atheist or anti-theistic, aren't they right in challenging any kind of belief in the afterlife? See, this is where I do kind of stand with those among the atheistic group, because part of my real concern is to suggest that just because I would, for argument's sake, suggest that there really is no life after death, that life is all that anyone has ever known, that each of us come into the world, and by the time each of us finds ourselves, we've always already begun, and then as you're approaching the end of your life, you always have something still outstanding, and then it's like, I'm dying, you never really get to I'm dead. And in that sense, life is eternal. It's like life has opened to itself a kind of the eternal aspect of life. I mean, and by that I mean everything that's ever been. I mean, if someone wants to say, well, it has a certain age, well, fine. We're going to say all that has ever been. It somehow opens to itself by haunting itself with bodies that can only know themselves without ever having to deal with themselves from the outside. Because you're never there before your birth and you're never there after your death. And in that sense, again, life opens to itself in a kind of paradoxical eternality. And I guess, but you can say all of that, but you still have to then, I think, accept that we are animals who will die. And there are people who are motivated to do horrible, horrible things by promises of an afterlife.
Mm-hmm. And Professor, I understand where that position, is coming from, and I understand how that can be justified, and I can understand, the problems with kind of focusing on this eternality, this afterlife concept. Ultimately, though, however, I think what I would say is that that's mainly a problem of kind of seeing the world in a very unbalanced manner. For instance, I can still have a great appreciation for the life that I'm currently living and also understand the consequences of it, while also recognizing the afterlife. I think it's really how much we put stock into those particular notions and beliefs. I mean, for instance, I could bring up the fact also that while atheists may not particularly have the concept of an afterlife, they can still put a lot of stock in, for instance, the concept of progress or sort of these many things, and they have. I mean, historically speaking, I mean, we have this sort of, please correct me if I'm wrong, Enlightenment, quote unquote, dogma, this idea of scientific progress, and a lot of atheists did put this sort of almost spiritual, energy into this idea, this concept, and in a sense, they actually did a lot of horrible things as well, and not because they're atheists.
True. I think that's true. I guess that's a wonderful. I think there's so much wonderful stuff that's going on there. Yeah, so I think there is a kind of historical competition between meta narratives there, between do we try to bring about salvation here on this planet? This is kind of the early Marxist argument that we need to join hands, give up property, and this is the only place where salvation could ever be possible. To the best that it could be managed would be here. Whereas I think other people went, it's so impossible, it's so fraught with hardship that if there's going to ever be an ultimate justice, it has to be in some sort of here else. I guess I would want to argue for a middle ground. I mean, I do think the Stoics, I think the Stoics had a kind of worldview that potentially opened up, I guess, a space between believing in progress as if more things were going to make you happier, as if more material, I think there is a real problem with that. I think there is something about basic health, though. I would want to say that, increasing life expectancy and extending basic health care, antibiotics, things like this, the invention of morphine as it ended public torture. I mean, there's a lot of things that I think we do want to stress are very important. But maybe the thing to go back to is, but what evidence is there at all that there is an afterlife? See, there I would want to say, I don't think there really is any, but I think we have lots of evidence that people do bad things because they imagine some justice in the afterlife. Now, some people might say, well, people do horrible things because they don't believe in the afterlife. See, I think this is the counter argument. People say, well, without fear of God or some person punishing people, what will keep people in check? Do you think that people will need some notion of an afterlife or something like that in order to keep individuals from doing evils? Because I guess I don't think that.
Actually, I have to agree with you. I don't think that concept actually assists in any sort of, keeping people from doing anything bad.
Okay.
I mean, ultimately, I think that people will ultimately do bad things because they can get away with it, and also because it gives them a sense of power. And I don't think the beliefs really have too much to do with it. I mean, I guess I take a more of an approach that human beings, if they want to be bad, they're going to be bad. If they want something, they want something. If they have a particular desire for something, they're going to do it regardless of whatever consequences are there. I mean, there's so many criminals who, in the societies we live in, who know the consequences of their actions rather well, and yet they still do these things because they think they can get away with it, even though they know that there are real consequences to their actions.
Yeah.
So even if they believed, for instance, there was an afterlife, I mean, I think they would patently ignore it. And I think it's easier to ignore because it's not immediately in front of them. It is so abstract, from their mindset.
Boy, I don't know. I guess part of me would be inclined to say that I think there are some people who at some level are like satisfied with the thought that there will be justice later, and that they will be punished, and that there is enough justice in the world. As odd as that sounds, I don't think that people who are caught in those narratives of good and evil and that struggle and are doing that, I don't know that they don't, like, I think, for example, I think there are many people who are among the Christian faith and the Christian right, just as an example. I mean, the Christian right has a lot of political force in the U.S., and it is largely a conservative, very Christian, right-wing group. And I think they need to believe in the afterlife because they have so much in social inequality. They have banked so much in terms of private property, which the Bible sanctions. I mean, the Bible sanctions their. You see, I think people have said to me, "No, Corey, you're wrong. That it's not that people need the God and the Bible to sanction private property in these institutions. That it's a civil arrangement, and it's by civil law we have that." I think no, that's really not true at all. See, I think that's really missing the dynamic. I think what happened, and this is why Christianity led to Darwin so quickly and so easily, is that people went from there is a divinely inspired order, and that's why there's a difference between the haves and have-nots, to it was survival of the fittest, and that's why there's a difference between the haves and the have-nots. There are different meta-narratives that account for existing social inequalities. The belief that the people who have the most deserve to be there because they were the fittest, that's the lie. That's utterly a lie. Not that some people haven't worked harder than other people, but I think it's like people need these sort of meta-level sanctioning agents, and religion, I think, serves that. Because of that, many people have built their lives out of partisan interests. They've served their children well, and maybe their relatives well. They've left children in other places starving, and now they need to believe that someone else is going to serve justice. How else could people sleep at night? How could people with multiple homes, lots and lots of wealth, with starving children around the world, sleep with themselves? Explain this. Why is it that in the U.S., which is a very Christian nation, they lead the world in donating to anonymous charities around the world? It all makes sense. The guilty conscience is so clear.
I mean, going back to the previous point too.
Okay.
I think there is a way to balance out this sort of concept of justice, whether in the afterlife or even in this one.
Okay.
For instance, my perspective, and even from a lot of Muslims that I know as well, suggests that in order to get justice in the afterlife, you must put an almost equal amount of justice here. So in a sense, it's sort of a balancing act. We try to do that. We do try to level ourselves as much as possible, regardless of the fact that there is something else that we think is after this life. And I think it's possible. I think really the main problem, and I'm going to keep emphasizing this, is really... and I don't like to emphasize, because it kind of sounds sort of like the sin condition, which is not really something I believe in, or many other Muslims do as well. But there is really a problem with human beings and kind of what they desire. And I really feel like even if the Christian right didn't have Christianity, though I think it is very helpful for their agenda, don't get me wrong, I think that those sort of people...
Excuse me.
Oh, that's okay. Bless you. I think those sort of people would, because of their mentality, because they kind of feel like they need this power, or they want certain things, will try to find some other belief system to sort of cater to those sort of inclinations.
Can you talk more about that? I mean, I guess I'm very interested in this question of the problematic nature of human desire.
I mean, yeah, and if you don't mind, I'm going to do this from sort of a Muslim perspective and stream it.
I just want to understand it. Yeah.
I mean, for instance, many of the moderate Muslims in the world will look at the Quran and will kind of look at it, and will know that the fighting verses, for instance, are mainly emphasizing self-defense. Whereas a lot of the extremists, whenever they kind of do their own exegesis and they kind of look at the Quran, they try to make a lot of theological excuses, suggesting why they should kill innocent people, for instance, or why they should bomb people. And oftentimes they come from a very politically charged perspective. They talk about, well, my family was bombed by military, from the United States and such. And because of that desire for revenge, they'll want to have, a meta-narrative that gives them sort of a justification to fight back, even regardless of the fact that they may win or not. I think really our personal experiences really are one of the major reasons that we choose the meta-narratives, that we follow.
Right.
And I think, for instance, that also might tie into the fact that a lot of these current anti-theists are going to this meta-narrative that religion is evil, or it needs to be destroyed either intellectually or otherwise. I've heard some atheists say otherwise in a physical sense. And I think they do that because what they've experienced is extremism of its own from the Christian right.
Right.
So they think that that's kind of, maybe that's not all that exists, but that's all they've really seen.
Right.
So that's, in a sense, maybe it's mainly psychological. That's what I'm trying to...
Right. I mean, I think, sort of rallying around that issue or that question, I think from my own perspective, it's, this question of, is human desire problematic? I mean, I would say that, that we are that site of nature which has encumbered a problem of self-relation. That as other organisms, even if they have a sense of self, it's a dulled down sense of self. It's not hyper-attuned toward its past, its distant future, concerns with what it's going to do with its life. I don't know if other animals live in despair and angst over what they're doing or not doing with their lives, how they failed their grandparents, kind of stuff. I think humans do have a problem with self-relation. See, but now this doubles back to the very beginning of the discussion over why I think Christianity is problematic, but also holds the seeds of a kind of liberation for a new spirituality. Because I think Christianity, by not being the religion of a particular people, opened the possibility of a personal relationship with God, right? Now, as much as I think that's not the language that I would use. I would call it, the problem of self-relation that nature has evolved into. But I think they're right-minded about a kind of evolution of the possibility of love for the stranger, for the other who is unknown to one's own community. And a kind of global consciousness is partly related to a sense of genuine concern for those who don't necessarily share one's background or one's culture. But again, with this, I still want to be able to, how do we protect and preserve cultural practices and religious institutions from, I wouldn't want to see in the rise of a kind of biologically friendly theology or a naturalist theology to erode, the rich, cultural, historical practices that make up the world's religions. Right? But I think a lot of these different world's religions, though, they're going to have to reckon in this millennium with science. They're going to have to come to terms with the facts that have been accumulated. And if they try to keep putting, like I saw a guy recently trying to understand quantum mechanics and was suggesting that the Holy Spirit was actually at the quantum level. And the guy, he doesn't understand what the point of, when you try to say that the quantum mechanics are relevant to a theological position, I think the point is that human relations are as real as the things themselves. And the more that we understand that relations are as real as things themselves, we start to understand that consciousness is part of reality. You can't just deal with, like, scientific materialism as if the world is made up of nothing but the materials there. That will probably work for a lot of things. It's not going to work for everything, especially the problem of relations and the kinds of relations that consciousness makes possible, not just represents.
I agree. I think that the way it can really be solved to keep these sort of cultural practices, and we always have to, I think, start from the idea that you can't impose your particular moral sentiments on others, and I don't even think that's simply a liberal opinion. I think that's an opinion that even the majority of religious people have held. You can't impose. That's part of morality, is not imposing your concepts on others. Of course, unless they're harming you or the rest of society, that's a different picture. And I think there are a lot of people, religious people, that are kind of having problem with the scientific discoveries that are occurring today, and I think that has a lot to do with the literalism of Scripture. And if we even go to the Christian tradition, the Catholic Church, and even the Catholic Church has sort of had a bad record, but even the Eastern Orthodox Church, they tend to view their Scriptures from the perspective of tradition rather than having a literalistic interpretation. And even Muslims have done the same thing. So I really think it's not religion as a whole, but really a particular branch and this very fanatical, I guess you could say, version. And if we can't conform our religious traditions to scientific understanding, then those religions or those interpretations are going to die. And I think we should conform our understanding of religion based on these scientific discoveries, because, I mean, when it comes down to it, our experiences are what are defining the scripture to begin with. And part of that experience is what we understand of science.
Right.
So anything that seems to contradict what we understand scientifically, I think, needs to be discarded.
Yeah. See, so okay, Ali, this is such a $1 million moment here. We're at such a good point here, because I think the more that we discover about the world, the more that we end up changing who we are. See, now, if we do this, okay, so, Phil Helenius has this video where he says the internet is the place where religions come to die. Mm-hmm. And, I think we were talking just a little bit before we started taping about trying to give a religious history in terms of communication technologies. I think if one were to do that, you could sort of begin with the earliest peoples where they lived for tens, maybe 100,000 years of holy oral word. And the oral word was an animated spiritual connection with the cosmos, sort of eternal order there, echoed in seasonal rhythms and in sort of sacred beauty as a register of the mystery itself. And hunter-gatherer societies. But then slowly, as literacy sets in and, money and exchange sets in, now you start to change timeless laws of regularity for permanent rules that have been written down, and you start to have the establishment of authority and religious kings, divine kings, and it becomes more and more institutionalized, and great religious traditions start to form around sacred texts, and they become these, again, dogmatic, institutionalized groups. By the time you get to the printing press becomes this explosion of proliferation of new nationalistic interpretations made possible by language translations of the Bible, and new sects of Christianity start to spread out. Radical individualist, nationalistic notions of religion, because people can read the Bible for themselves. It becomes basically given in their native tongue rather than they hear it in the priest. I mean, the priest starts to turn around to people rather than having his back to the people. All these kinds of things start to go on. By the time you get to by the time you get to the telegraph's first message, the first message that was broadcast through the telegraph was, "What hath God wrought?" People were so scared. I mean, the first message came through. It brought back all kinds of senses of spirit worship. People started to believe they can contact the dead. All these kinds of and so for Marshall McLuhan, he says it's like we're playing history now in reverse, but with eyes wide open. And it's almost like, if at the first part you could see, humans were, I guess, again, emerged from animality to a self-astonished organism that had self-awareness dawned upon it before it knew what hit it. And it was with a world by which it needed the gods in order to register its own self-awareness. That itself grew into all kinds of dogma. But then it was too much for the organism. The animal couldn't handle the kind of awe and mystery of being that part of the cosmos. And now the desire to become a machine, to become a cyborg, the onset of the singularity, as people yearn for the animality they have lost by becoming machines, and they're going to implant a chip that by an algorithm deals with all that messy problem of evaluation and stuff. It's like we're going to come full circle where religiosity was a kind of blip in that one part of nature that tried to tolerate freedom for a while. And, the animal just jumped through religiosity into being a cyborg, man. You can see it coming, man.
Yeah, I think...
Can I just, one last thing is, I think what it means, though, is that we don't have to say that religion will die. It just may well mean that religions aren't going to be able to live in the internet. If you want to practice your religion, you may have to do it in the oral word, you may have to do it in the written word, you may have to do it in community and in song, and if you try to bring it into this world, look out, the medium will kill it.
Yeah, I mean, I see this sort of cold way of communication now, especially not even something on the internet in the sort of medium, but also with sort of our scientific understanding. We're starting to define things in very technical and cold terms, and this sort of, in my opinion, is sort of destroying. And I don't mean to say this as an insult to anybody who may be listening to this. It's sort of destroying our humanity.
It's tough, man. It's really tough.
I have a quote from
what do we
Einstein.
mean by human? It would be a different way to ask it.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question. I think to be human is not. It means a lot of things. I mean, I think for one, it means to be in constant awe. And I think this sort of one of the problems is the scientific understanding that we're currently having is that we're kind of getting this notion now that we can know everything, or that we will, and this sort of certainty has in a way kind of defined. Really, it's kind of almost in a sense told the future for us. We don't really. It's like as though we don't have a choice anymore. I'm sounding very vague there. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm trying to look at this quote, but Einstein said this, and I always enjoyed this quote. But he said, "What need is there for responsibility? I believe that the horrifying deterioration in the ethical conduct of people today stems from the mechanization and dehumanization of our lives, a disastrous byproduct of the development of the scientific and technical mentality. We are guilty. Man grows cold faster than the planet he inhabits."
Yeah. See, I think that's wonderful because I think Einstein there is a great person to cite, and I think he's qualifying, and it's I think one that we need to recognize that qualification, where there's a difference between science and the really great scientists and scientism, which has been largely left to the technicians and the people who are too eager to fumble around with technologies by which they can have more ease and convenience and comfort, but couldn't tell you a damn thing about how any of them work.
Yeah, I think you hit a big nerve there. A lot of people are probably going to come after for that word, scientism, and I think we really should probably talk about what scientism is first, because I've heard a lot of people don't really know what that means. I mean, Cyril Karl Popper went against it quite a bit. Scientism being the idea, and I don't know if you have maybe a different definition, but my understanding of it is that we can define and we can understand everything through scientific, inquiry, just
Right.
basic, and I don't think that's possible, especially when we get into ethics.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are different spheres. I think some people would talk about, there's an ethical sphere, there's a practical sphere, and there's an aesthetic sphere, and they sometimes have overlap, but it would be reductive to try to reduce any one of those to the other spheres. I mean, I think we need to try to understand the logic and the kinds of coherence and what we mean by a truth statement in those different spheres.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I want to. I really want to go back to that question of what it means to be human too.
Okay,
I think I want to touch up on one thing because that's I think it's the most important question probably in the discussion, given that we're sort of trying to understand the role of religion and science in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we are the paradoxical manifestation by which the Eternal tried to cheat its own death by haunting itself as another. I mean, we are, it's not that you're eternal, but it's that you're the way the eternal was able to haunt itself as another by you being finite. And too many people, instead of understanding themselves as a gift that God gave to itself in order to make an odyssey through time on borrowed life and on borrowed breath. Instead, they've identified with their ego, they imagine it's all about them, and they think that the goal of life is to somehow secure something afterward. They don't know how to look into another person's eyes and see the wearer of that other person as a mask. They don't know how to recognize in genuine lover that there's only one community, the community of the dying. We're all dying together.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we are. I think humanity as a whole is kind of going into that sort of poetic prose. I think humanity as a whole is kind of a tragic painting. We're part of a very beautiful, yet ugly, picture, but each one makes up just simply a blot of color. And when I refer to God, even people often ask me, well, what was the point of God creating us? And I said, well, does it really have to be one? Uh, what if he's simply an artist and we're just part?
That's right.
And
That's right.
I think you're right. Maybe, and please correct me if I'm wrong about how I'm interpreting your words, but maybe if we saw life more as a sort of a chaos, rather than this set thing,
Yeah.
then maybe we would stop thinking that we have any sort of control.
Oh yeah. I don't know if you've read much of the Stoics, but I mean, Epictetus is absolutely brilliant. I mean, the first and most important principle in Stoicism is learning to differentiate between what's under your control and what's not under your control. And if it's not under your control, it could be neither good nor evil. The only good or evil comes from aligning yourself with what's under your control and giving up on everything that's outside of your control. And learning to draw that distinction is key. That's why death is nothing to you. Even the question of the afterlife. If there is an afterlife, the gods saw fit for no one to ever know if there is or isn't one. I mean, it's sort of like, and that's good. For the Stoic position, that's good. Because why? Because that's something that's completely out of your control. I mean, you have to be indifferent to it, I guess.
I agree, and I think that I think even many theists in general would actually even agree with that principle as well. Even though it's true that many theists say, "Well, I know there's an afterlife." I think that's a ridiculous statement to make. I think many theists, including myself, make the statement that we believe in the afterlife based on the fact that we believe in God, we trust. I mean, that is the definition of faith for many people, is a sort of trust.
Why does God relate to the afterlife?
How does he relate to the afterlife?
Why? Well, yeah, how? I mean, I guess I don't understand it. The Stoics had no belief in the afterlife, but they had a deep, deep sense of fate, of providence, of divine order, of harmony. They called it the highest mind. Again, it wasn't like a doer of deeds, it wasn't a person intervening, but it wasn't like a deism who was just indifferent to the world. There was a kind of indifferent benevolence that was just in the very, like the beauty that's left over in the order of the world was a kind of reminder to people of the sacredness of it. I mean, I don't know,
as to your question, I mean, I think the way that we sort of justify whether we can believe in that or not is based on our certainty or on more foundational concepts. And this is a poor analogy, but the fact that I know that addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division are working things. The rest mathematics that are founded on it, I can trust. I think rather well. And that is a poor analogy, but just kind of give an understanding that I don't know, for instance, that there's an afterlife, but I believe it's such because I believe other things that I'm more certain of that confirm it for me. That say, it's sort of a trusting authority, I guess you could say. And I understand maybe the Stoics didn't have this concept.
No, they did. They trusted that that it makes sense for people to die. I mean, I think they looked around and they thought, there's really just, and sort of going back to your notion of chaos. Yeah, I don't know if I can do it here for you, but it's from Cleanthes' hymn to Zeus. He says, "Chaos to thee is order in thine eyes. The unlovely is lovely who did harmonize things evil with things good, that there should be one word through all things, everlastingly." I mean, there is a kind of harmony of integration of evil and good in the chaos that for the highest mind is its own kind of order.
And I would agree with that sentiment. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. I mean, probably better than what I said.
Hey, so we're about 47 minutes into this. I don't know how many people are going to be continuing to watch this here, but why don't I give you the last word? What should you want to say one last thing or final comments on our discussion?
I think there's so much more we could talk about, and I really hope that we could continue a discussion later on about maybe some of the more finer points, especially about the recent phenomenon with the anti-theist movement, new atheists, etc. But what I really want to say is that I think that one of the major problems right now concerning dialogue is that we sort of think this accommodationist principle is not workable. You know, we're starting to see that, I mean, people are kind of buying into this narrative that we can't get along and that we can't find some sort of common ground. And sometimes there isn't common ground, but if we're going to continue asking these questions, if we're going to continue having these discussions, we have to find it first. And because if we keep fighting with each other and we have these very narrow-minded, biased viewpoints, I don't think we're ever going to really answer the questions that we really want to answer and that are really important to us. So,
Ali, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you want to say anything else too, Professor? Or?
I don't think so. I think that was really fun. I enjoyed the time, and I hope that we can talk more again. I would hope that some people shoot some responses to this, and we'll see if we can't get some further dialogue.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for speaking with me. I know you have a busy schedule, so inshallah we will talk about this later, I guess.
Okay, take care.
All right, take care.
Bye.